A seat. Want to make plenty of time to visit with Pastor Joe. And Joe, you can relax for a minute. I'm going to set us up here and have us turn our attention towards God's Word this morning. The Epiphany light that we journey in with Jesus. We've been spending Sundays this January in the Epiphany season, and God showing us His presence through Jesus. We began celebrating the baptism of Jesus and heard God announce that as Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, "This is my Son," and that little phrase, "Listen to him," God announced from the heavens when Jesus was baptized. And that was our turnaround Sunday, if you recall. We actually turned the whole church around, Joe, and faced the outdoors. And we were reminded at the center of our life is God's claim upon us as baptized people. Well, the very next Sunday, we realized the depth of what it means that God is with us when we journeyed with Jesus in an experience that is common to every human being, and that is when we encounter evil. And when we experience temptation. It was a fascinating Bible passage to see that the Spirit of God actually drove Jesus into the wilderness where he was tempted by the devil. And it shows us that this experience that we all have of temptation and confronting evil is what God experienced in Jesus and shows us the way. And we found that the way is made for us through our relationship with God and the Word. At the center of our life, we have Jesus as a role model, and we have equipment for facing temptation and evil as we draw close to one another, our relationship with God through His Word. Well, it's true, isn't it, if we have been worshiping people, that the hearing of God's Word, the reading of Scripture, the sermon that we hear on Sundays, is a time for us to be reconnected to God. Hopefully jolts us a little bit out of our daily life and into a real encounter with the living God and what God wants for our lives. It shouldn't be any surprise then on this third Sunday of the Epiphany that God has revealed to us in the Word of a sermon. But not just any sermon, it's Jesus' first sermon that was recorded. We have record of it in the 5th chapter of Matthew, and what we're going to hear today are the opening words of Jesus' first sermon. So Gary, put the lights down, and then if you have your audio ready, we're going to watch this as a video presentation first.
And he began to teach them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown great mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. They will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, lie about you, and say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Be excited, because great is your reward in heaven. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. You cannot be hidden. People don't light a lamp and put it under a cover. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, they may see your good deeds and pray the Father in heaven. Matthew 5.
So Jesus preached his first sermon with his eye on the poor. He spoke his first message, and the words fell on those who were overwhelmed with sadness. His words went to the heart of those who hungered and thirsted for righteousness. It's a very moving scene in the Bible of crowds of people who have followed Jesus to hear him. And it's interesting to read the original language of the Greek. It says, as Jesus looked out at the people, his stomach, his heart turned over. It really says, with compassion, because the people were like sheep without a shepherd. And he taught them many things. And these are the opening words of his first sermon. Blessed are you. It's easy to imagine that these listeners did not feel blessed. But Jesus was preaching God's being into them and creating them to be people of God. But he wasn't just preaching to a nameless crowd. The Bible's pretty clear that as he began to speak to the crowd, he drew his 12 disciples near him. It's an interesting image to see the crowd and then Jesus saying, now I want you 12 to come and sit here, because I really want you to hear this. And so, if we are among those who are praying today, that we would be among God's followers, or literally to be a disciple means to be God's learners. If we are asking God to make us his learners, we sit at his feet, and he's speaking right to us. And he says something pretty incredible at the end. He says to the disciples and to us, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. It's amazing. Not, I'm the salt, I'm the light, you're my followers, but you are the salt and the light. It's hard to imagine how many sermons I've heard through my 56 years, but I remember being a little boy in that small farm town of Holman, and Sunday after Sunday we went to church and we heard the word. And I don't know entirely the forces that move in our lives that cause things to happen as they do, but when I grew up and went away to the University of Wisconsin in Eau Claire, I remember being about 20 years old and not being sure what I was going to do with my life. I'd tried as a music major, and it just wasn't going to happen. I could not see myself being a band director. No offense to band directors. I was very worried about getting passing grades, seriously worried, because I'd done so poorly in high school. But somehow, by the time I was a junior, 20 years old or so, I began to read some things on my own. And I don't know what caused me to do it. I don't know how I felt I had time. It wasn't any reading that I did for assignment or coursework. I just began to read everything I could find that was directly written by or authored by those that were with Dr. Martin Luther King. I can't remember why I got started. I don't know how I made time, but it happened pretty quickly. I first encountered My Life with Martin, written by his wife, Coretta Scott King. I still remember passages from it all these years later. Quickly to Stride Toward Freedom and the story of the Montgomery bus boycott, and to Why We Can't Wait, and the letter from a Birmingham jail. Where We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, written closer to the end of his life, and finally a compilation of his sermons, Strength to Love. I read them all, one after another. Somehow or other, there was time, because I think it might have had to do with this music major hearing that sermon that he preached, which was called The Drum Major Instinct. I could relate to drum majors at the head of the band, and it was the sermon King preached when the disciples were arguing about who was going to be great, and they wanted to be great and sit at God's right hand, at Jesus' right hand, and Jesus had them sit down, and he said, look, if you want to be great, you must be servant of everyone. And King preached and said, you know, Jesus didn't say it's wrong to want to be great. He said, if you want to be great, you'll be a servant. And that was the launching point for his sermon, The Drum Major Instinct. It's not wrong to lead. What are you leading for? What difference are you making in the world? Be a drum major for justice. Be a drum major for peace. And so on in that incredible sermon. Well, my journey eventually led me into seminary, and this seed that had been planted in my life continued to lead me in interesting paths. While I was studying in Japan, I wrote a letter to the university in Boston University School of Theology. I said I'd like to study there because that's where Dr. King got his doctorate. And lo and behold, 2 years later, as part of the Lutheran flow, I took a non-Lutheran year at at Boston University in the Boston Theological Institute, where I had a chance to study under the very professor that directed King's PhD thesis, G. Walter Mueller, and learned about the social gospel and the work of God in being salt for the world and light for all people, even those who live in great darkness. Well, eventually, as the path would unfold, some 10 years after that, I came to Milwaukee to plant All People's Church, 2nd and Clark. And I discovered that I had a neighbor by the name of Joe Ellwager, who I was told had walked and marched with Dr. Martin Luther King. That got my attention. And I was stirred by getting to know Joe. By that time, I was deeply committed to what God does in congregations. Deeply affected by how God works to shape our lives through the hearing of the Word and interacting in the Word and in the relationships of faith communities. This is how our lives are formed and how God moves. And I was especially moved that Joe, in the midst of his work, having been in Birmingham, Alabama 9 years, and then eventually 35 years at Cross Church at 16th and Vine, was at heart a pastor of a congregation, and Cross Church itself went from the time he arrived in about 1967, a predominantly white church, 35 years later, to one of the largest predominantly African-American Lutheran churches in the evangelical Lutheran Church in America. When I think about being salt and light, I'm moved by your ministry, Joe, and this book that you've written. Come and join me up here. We're going to talk a little bit about this. I'm going to set up a chair here, and you can say hello to everybody and tell them about your wife, and that'll be a good sound check. I think Gary's ready to run your mic back there. Tell everybody hello, sir.
Good morning to everybody. It is a pleasure, an honor to be here, and it was a very special honor to be a pastor in the same community of Central City, Milwaukee, with your pastor, Greg, who did a great job at All People's Church, and definitely a pleasure to see the kind of ministry that continues to salt the earth out here in Muskego that you are leading now. And
well, it was interesting. This morning I tapped on the house I think you've probably lived in, you said 47 years?
47.
At 16th and Vine, about a block from across, and his wife was hard at study there at the table. I said, you don't have men knocking on your window early Sunday morning very often, I bet. So let's see, how did we get so far ahead here? Okay. Well, I was going to mention these moments. You were there in Birmingham with Brother Bull Connor as the chief of police, and when the hoses and the dogs were released upon the people who were lobbying for simple things like the opportunity to ride buses together and to sit at lunch counters and eat together and to use the same water fountains in restaurants and to have voting rights. It's an amazing time that you lived through right at the heart of that. Joyce tells me you wrote this book in some 8 years, and you mentioned to me that a lot of that was delayed by the organizing that you've been doing for Micah or for the Gamaliel Foundation and Wisdom around Wisconsin.
That's right. I helped to start congregation-based organizing groups that work on justice in places like La Crosse and Eau Claire and Appleton and Green Bay and Madison, and it gave quite a base of strength and power then for people who want to make a change and work on justice and be salt and light in a more radical way. It gave them a base to operate, especially in Madison, to have that strength all over the state.
Tell us about the cover story, this rather interesting moment in your life. What's happening in the picture on the cover of your book?
Well, this is an interesting moment. I won't forget it. It's March 6th, 1965, and didn't sleep that well the night before because we had absolutely no idea what was going to happen on March 6th, other than the fact that we had put out a call to white folks in Alabama and said, if you want to support the voting rights movement in Selma, come on March 6th, Saturday, and march with us and say to Alabama and to the United States that there are white people in Alabama who support this movement. And so this is the day, and this is the moment when we arrived. I was leading this. We managed to get 72 from all over the state, 72 white persons. Not a huge number, but 72 more than most white folks and black folks thought would ever come and go public in support of Voting Rights Act. So we came to this moment, and I'm the guy with his back to the cover and the picture.
A little more hair.
A little bit of hair, not a whole lot more, a little more. And the three men in front of me there are the sheriff's deputies. They stopped us at the courthouse, and you have to understand that to the right of us and me were about 300, 400 white Ku Klux Klansmen with bats and clubs and steel pipes. And to our left, across the street, were about 400 African Americans who came, I think, to see whether we would show up. And also to protect us. And on that day, they were our protection. They were the folks that counterbalanced the 300, 400 KKK men.
And this is a sheriff's deputy reading something to you.
Yes, he's reading a telegram from none other than the president of the Southern District of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which is the equivalent of the bishop, my bishop. And so he's reading this telegram, and he says, I have a telegram from the Reverend Edgar Holmrighausen, and it began this way. I can still remember the words, they're in the book. The Reverend Joseph Ellwager does not represent the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod in his actions here today. Now, I suppose this was his way of doing something that would hopefully clear the deck for his relationships with others in the Southern District, but it was perceived and recognized by the members of my congregation in Birmingham, a black congregation, as a pushback, and all of the blacks understood that. Why would he send a telegram? But the interesting thing is that the sheriff's deputy, I think, thought he had an ace in the hole here, that he was going to really stop me, because why would I go against my bishop? And
now, historically, this is a significant moment, because your march, which took place that day, was how long before what's described as Bloody Sunday in the movie Selma?
Well, it's exactly the day before Bloody Sunday. We had no idea that that was going to happen the next day, but you're right, it was that day before. And the interesting point is that this march of 72 white Alabamians, the day before Bloody Sunday, was not a huge factor in the whole movement that led to a strong Voting Rights Act, but it was the one time in all of the civil rights movement in the 60s when white Southerners went public and said, we stand with these people who are working for justice, not just for themselves, but for all of us. And I think it's a good example of salt and light.
Well, let me encourage, I put a copy for our life group leaders of King's letter from a Birmingham jail, by the way, in the back of your life group notes that are available at the Welcome Center. But let me also encourage life groups, or any of us in groups, to go and see Selma. The film that's out right now, it again depicts the events that happened the day after this picture. And this was in Selma as well, right, this picture?
Oh, absolutely.
So, well, I'm going to set up this next question with a rather lengthy introduction, so bear with me. You know, I was pleased to read your book, and it took me quite a few weeks to finally get around to it. Ann had been to one of your coffee shop discussions, and I said, yeah, I'll read it. But, you know, I know Joe, and I know his story, and I've been around Joe. But finally, I read it when we had some time, and, you know, the start was kind of slow for me, and I'm guessing for some of the congregation it takes time to read. The early chapters may be less interesting in terms of there's a chapter and some thoughts on the theology of walking with the poor, and there's thoughts on growing the church. There's thoughts on worship and music, which I know we never struggle with, so that may not be interesting for anybody. But when you get into the chapters that have to do with these topics, I found myself stirred in the manner of when I was 20 years old again. You talk about the experience of establishing women as leaders in the church, of providing sanctuary for illegal immigrants, welcoming and blessing gay persons and couples, resettling refugees, walking with the incarcerated, community organizing in the campaign for treatment instead of prison, Project Return, supporting ex-offenders as they re-enter society. When I thought about your work over the decades at Cross and certainly in Birmingham, and I realized that so much of this was happening in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. I mean, some of this is still very controversial today. And again, the issue of how you were moved by the Spirit to be salt and light in the middle of what are hot button issues. But here's what struck me. I know I haven't gotten to my question yet, but I want. What struck me in these chapters was your pastoral heart. That I still remember as you were figuring out how to be a church that would welcome gay and lesbian people who came to your church seeking Jesus, and how you created movement on that issue, even while you gave space for people to disagree, and you assured people that if they would allow you, you would be their pastor, even if they didn't agree on the Spirit's movement that you felt was there. Tell us about the importance of your pastoral heart in social change, in being salt and light.
Absolutely. It's very important for Christians who are working for justice and for change, and I would hope that all Christians are doing that at some level whenever there is an injustice, working at justice. But it's very important for Christians and for clergy who are doing that to do it not because it's politically correct and not because this is my intellectual decision to do this, but because of the gospel. Not in spite of the gospel, but because of the gospel, the good news of God's love. If I'm working for change, for instance, as I am right now in the prison system, I am doing it because I believe that God's love calls me to recognize the dignity and the value of every human being, and therefore I must work to have even a correctional system in our state and in our nation that is recognizes the dignity even of people who have made some mistakes, maybe some really bad mistakes. But that gospel has got to lead me as a pastor when I'm leading people and as someone working for justice, or else it's just some political action, and it's not really the Christian action because of the gospel.
Well, and that you allowed conversation to happen within your congregation in a deliberative fashion that allowed people to struggle and yet not feel ostracized if they disagreed. It reminded me so much of what stirred me as a 20-year-old in seeing that Dr. King, through his study of Mahatma Gandhi, insisted, and then to the end of his life, that all of this movement that's inspired by God is non-violent social change. Non-violent. That seems to be a consistency with your pastoral heart.
Absolutely, and nonviolence is a bedrock value for the people of God and for people who are seeking change. As a matter of fact, if on Bloody Sunday, the folks who had marched over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and they got to the other side and they met this phalanx of law enforcement people that had cattle prods, some were on horses, some had rifles, they had tear gas, they met this phalanx. If they had pulled out their guns and gone into a battle on that occasion, there would not be any Voting Rights Act today. There would not have been that advance toward justice. But because they went simply standing for what was right, simply standing for justice and truth, the whole nation, after Bloody Sunday, said, wait a minute, what do we stand for as a nation?
Yeah.
And nonviolence was a very important tool and has to be the way in which we live our lives and go about making change.
Story after story, I want to move us quickly, but just a brief comment. I have not, there are a lot of these stories are told within the book, but when you were 26, 27 years old, you had what I would say most of us young pastors or any pastors that have worked with youth ministry have had a nice idea. You thought, let's have an exchange group with another church. You connected with a suburban white Alabama Lutheran church, and you connected some of your kids from your church in Birmingham, and they were African American. You had a little get together. What happened?
Well, you're lifting up a story that was really important for my life and my calling. So important that I have it in the book twice. If people recognize that, it's in the preface, and I realize some folks don't read the preface to a book, so I put it in the last chapter. But here's the story. This is in 1961, and we got an invitation from a white congregation in Tuscaloosa, we being a black congregation in Birmingham, and they invited us to bring some youth, black youth, to their white youth organization and group on a Sunday evening to have some fellowship. So this is an out-of-the-box invitation and an out-of-the-box decision on the part of our youth to go, because you need to understand that in those days, black and white youth in Alabama never went to school together, never went to basketball or football games together, never went to McDonald's together, never went to church together. There was no point at which youth ever met on an equal basis. So this was an unusual moment. Two of our youth said they would go, Carolyn Freeman and Betty Wells. So the three of us went, had a great evening, had good food, and had prayer and fellowship and sharing of stories, and the youth discovered that, boy, there's a lot that we have in common. But there's some things that we don't have in common because of the segregation. So as we went home that evening, Carolyn and Betty in the back seat of the car were just bubbling, as youth can do, and they were bubbling about the experience. They said, you know, this is what the church ought to do regularly and more often to bridge the racial gap and do what we did this evening. So it was that kind of a positive experience. But on Wednesday of that week, I picked up the paper from the front porch, and there on the front page of the Birmingham paper was the story of the KKK taking this white intern pastor in Tuscaloosa, who had invited us, taking him out to the edge of the city, beating him, and leaving him at midnight to walk back on the railroad tracks, and the cross burned in the yard of the church, and a note on the door that said, if you ever have another integrated youth meeting here, something worse will happen. Before I had finished reading the article in the paper, the phone rang, and a rough voice on the other end said, "Is this the Reverend?" And I said, "Yes, it is." And he said, "Well, you and the two girls are next. Click." Well, I knew after what happened that this was not some kind of an idle threat, so I knew I had to talk to the parents and to the girls. And I'm getting to the point of the story here. I'll never forget the conversation with Carolyn Freeman. I told her about the threat, and I asked her, "Are you afraid, Carolyn?" And this is a 15-year-old girl, you have to remember. She said, "No, I'm not so much afraid as I am ashamed." I said, "Carolyn, what do you mean you're ashamed?" And she said, "I'm ashamed that so many people have put their lives on the line for our freedom and the freedom of all people, and I have done so little." And for a 15-year-old girl to have this sense of the call, if you will, to be a part of the freedom movement that was happening, and to recognize what others had done and what others were doing, a sense of community, and a sense of something really deep and profound that God was calling her to, trumped any fear that she might have of the KKK. And that story has been a real strength for me over the years.
Well, I'm going to need to draw this to a close. I'm just going to draw a couple points that I'm not going to have time for you to comment on, but in the book you'll read about the 45th anniversary gathering of some of the people who were part of the marches in Selma, etc. And you ran into this guy, and I'm going to just say on behalf of Joe that moment where C.T. Vivian, who had been such a close colleague and friend of Dr. King's, approached you at the table and said, Joe, just think of what we had accomplished, what we've been part of, knowing how much there is yet to do. That had to just be so emotional. It really struck me. I've heard this wonderful man speak. I think that's about it, but I do want to mention when I had coffee with Joe a couple weeks ago, I said, boy, you're staying busy. He said, well, my mama said it's best to wear out rather than rust out. And these are just some of the things that you're still doing. This Martin Luther King All-a-thon, which we're invited to participate in on the Memorial Day Saturdays. It's raised so much for kids from the inner city who graduate high school to go on to higher education. You're bringing people to church on Sunday mornings to help them from the Cheney Center, which is a minimum security prison. You're supporting Governor Walker's transitional jobs program, among other things. You're teaching Bible class. Joe, God bless you. We are honored by your presence. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.